The day my Amish husband chose another woman, I was folding his shirts when I found the second set of house keys. Ordinary brass keys, three of them, threaded onto a small leather loop, tucked into the inside pocket of a coat he rarely wore. I stood there in our bedroom with warm laundry still in my arms, staring at three keys that did not belong to any door in our house, any building on our property, or any structure I had ever once seen in my entire life. And I felt something in my chest go completely perfectly still, the way the air goes still in the hour before a storm finally breaks. I remember the specific quality of the afternoon light coming through our bedroom window in that moment, ordinary golden late afternoon light, the kind that had fallen across that same room 1,000 times before, without ever once carrying any particular significance. And I remember thinking, with a strange detached clarity, even as my hands had begun to tremble, that I would likely remember this exact quality of light for the rest of my life, regardless of what I eventually learned those keys actually meant. I did not know, in that exact moment, what those keys meant, but I knew, with a certainty that arrived from somewhere deeper than rational thought, that my marriage had already ended, quietly and invisibly, weeks or months before I ever found the evidence sitting in my own hands. I just did not yet know who my husband had chosen, or how long he had been choosing her, one small invisible decision at a time, while I continued building an entire life around a man who had already, in every way that actually mattered, left it behind. My name is Sarah. I am 23 years old, and until 11 months ago, I believed I was living inside the marriage I had always wanted. This is the true story of the day I learned exactly how wrong I had been, and everything that happened in the months before and after that discovery finally forced the truth into the open. I want to start by telling you who I was before any of this happened, because I think you need to understand the specific kind of life I had built, and the specific kind of hope I had carried into it, in order to understand the size of what was eventually taken from me. I grew up just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a moderate Amish community that, while strict in many of the ways our world is strict, allowed slightly more flexibility than some of the more conservative districts nearby. My parents were practical, faithful people who raised 6 children on a modest dairy farm, and I was the second oldest, old enough to remember a childhood full of real work and real joy in roughly equal measure, milking cows before sunrise, canning vegetables through long summer afternoons, singing in German at church every other Sunday in a building that smelled permanently of wood polish and old hymnals. I remember, in particular, the specific texture of those Sunday mornings, the careful rustle of the congregation settling into long wooden benches, my mother's hand resting briefly on my shoulder during the opening hymn, the particular slow patience required to sit through a 3-hour service as a restless child, counting the minutes until the noon meal that always followed. I did not understand, at the time, how completely those Sunday mornings were shaping my own deepest assumptions about what a stable, faithful life was supposed to look like, assumptions I would carry, largely unexamined, directly into my own marriage several years later. I met Jacob when I was 19 years old, at a youth gathering hosted by a neighboring district, the kind of event where dozens of young people from several different communities come together for games and singing, and the careful, supervised socializing that our world permits between unmarried young men and women. He was 22, tall in the specific unhurried way that some men are tall, with a quiet confidence that I found immediately compelling, the kind of presence that did not need to perform itself loudly to be noticed. We spoke for the first time over a simple game of volleyball, a conversation about absolutely nothing of consequence, and yet I remember walking home that evening feeling a kind of lightness in my chest that I had never once experienced with any other young man I had previously courted casually. I told my older sister the same night that I believed I had just met someone important, a prediction she teased me about mercilessly for weeks afterward, right up until the moment it turned out to be entirely accurate. Our courtship lasted just over a year, conducted with the particular careful rhythm that courtship in our world always follows, supervised visits and long buggy rides, and the slow, patient accumulation of trust that eventually convinces two families that a marriage between their children makes sense. Jacob was attentive during that year in ways that genuinely impressed my own parents, remembering small details from our conversations, showing up reliably for every agreed visit, treating me, even during the careful formality of courtship, with a warmth that several of my friends told me, with some envy, they had not experienced from the young men courting them. I remember one particular evening during that courtship, perhaps 8 months in, when a sudden summer thunderstorm caught us during a long buggy ride home from a neighboring district, and Jacob, rather than rushing to outrun the weather the way many young men might have, simply slowed the horse and let the rain fall around us, telling me, with a quiet laugh I had not heard from him before, that he had always found genuine comfort in storms rather than fear of them, and that he hoped whatever life eventually brought us, that I might come to feel the same. I thought of that evening, often during the years that followed, and I think now of how completely that particular calm steadiness turned out to be, only one part of a far more complicated man than I had ever imagined him to be during those careful courtship months. We married when I was 20 years old, in a wedding that nearly 300 people attended, held in my parents' barn on a crisp November morning, that I remember, even now, with a clarity that almost hurts to access, given everything I know now about how the story actually ends. I wore the deep blue dress my mother and I had spent weeks sewing together. Jacob looked at me, during the ceremony, with an expression I genuinely believed, at the time, was the look of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because I think it matters enormously to everything that follows. I was not a foolish young woman entering a marriage with unrealistic expectations. I was a clear-eyed 20-year-old who had watched her own parents build a genuinely strong marriage across nearly 3 decades, who understood the real work that sustaining a lifelong partnership actually requires, and who believed, with good reason given everything I had observed during our courtship, that I was marrying a man capable of that same kind of sustained, faithful commitment. The first 2 years of our marriage were, by almost every measure I had available to judge them, genuinely good years. We built a small house on a corner of Jacob's family's land, modest but entirely our own, and we settled into the particular rhythm that young married couples in our world settle into: work and worship and the slow accumulation of a shared life built one ordinary day at a time. Jacob worked alongside his father and older brothers on the family farm, while also developing a small side business repairing farm equipment, a skill he had a genuine natural talent for, and one that brought in steady additional income that allowed us, within our first 18 months of marriage, to begin discreetly saving toward eventually purchasing our own larger property. I kept our small house, took in occasional sewing work from neighboring families, and found throughout those early years a quiet satisfaction in the particular shape of the life we were building together that I had genuinely hoped marriage would provide. I do not want to paint these years as flawless, because no real marriage is flawless, and I think the honesty of this story depends on me being truthful about the actual texture of our life together, rather than presenting some idealized version of it. We had ordinary disagreements, the kind every young couple has, about money and about how to balance time between our own household and our respective extended families. Jacob could be stubborn once he had settled on an opinion, slow to reconsider a position, even when I offered him good reasons to do so. I could be impatient, particularly during the early months of our marriage, when I was still adjusting to the specific demands of running an entire household for the first time in my life. But underneath these ordinary frictions, I believed completely in the fundamental solidity of what we were building. I believed watching Jacob work tirelessly on our shared future, watching him show up reliably for every obligation our community and our families required of him, that I had married exactly the kind of steady, committed man I had hoped to find. It was during our 3rd year of marriage, roughly 14 months before I found those 3 brass keys, that something began to shift, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, in ways I did not fully recognize as significant until I had the benefit of hindsight to help me understand what I had actually been witnessing. The shift began with small absences. Jacob's equipment repair business had grown steadily over our years of marriage, requiring him to travel periodically to neighboring districts to service machinery for customers who did not live close enough to bring their equipment directly to him. These trips had always existed in some form throughout our marriage, but I began to notice, sometime during that third year, that they had become slightly more frequent and slightly longer in duration than they had been previously. I did not think much of this shift initially. Business growth seemed like a perfectly reasonable explanation for slightly increased travel, and Jacob always returned from these trips with concrete evidence of the work he had completed. Invoices and payment received, and specific details about the equipment he had repaired, details that gave me no reason to question the basic premise of where he had actually been. What I noticed more gradually, and what I found, looking back now, considerably more difficult to explain away through ordinary business growth, was a subtle change in Jacob himself during the months he was traveling more frequently. He grew quieter at home, in a way that felt different from his ordinary steady quietness, a kind of distance that I attributed for a long time simply to the exhaustion of an increasingly demanding work schedule. He began checking with what I eventually recognized as unusual frequency the small calendar we kept in our kitchen, a habit that struck me as slightly odd, given that he had always simply remembered his own schedule without needing to consult a written record so consistently. I asked him on several occasions during that period whether everything was all right, whether the increased workload was becoming too much for him to manage comfortably. He always assured me that everything was fine, that he was simply tired from the additional travel, an explanation that satisfied me at the time because I had no specific reason to doubt it, and because Jacob had never, throughout our entire marriage up to that point, given me cause to suspect that his explanations for anything might be less than fully honest. I want to tell you about a specific evening, roughly 4 months before I found the keys, because I believe now, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, that this was the evening everything fundamentally changed, even though I did not understand its significance at the time. Jacob had returned from a 3-day trip servicing equipment in a district nearly 40 miles from our own, a trip slightly longer than his previous travels had typically required. He seemed different that evening in a way I struggled to articulate even to myself, a kind of nervous energy underneath his usual calm exterior that I had never previously observed in him. We sat together on our small porch after the children, our 2 young sons, had been put to bed, and I asked him gently whether something had happened during his trip that he wanted to discuss. He was quiet for a long moment, longer than felt entirely comfortable, and then he told me that he had been thinking lately about whether our life together was actually the life he wanted to be living. I want you to understand how completely unprepared I was for this statement, arriving as it did after 3 years of marriage, that I had genuinely believed to be fundamentally solid. I asked him what he meant, and he told me with a careful vagueness that I now understand was deliberately calculated rather than genuinely uncertain, that he sometimes wondered whether he had married too young, whether there were entire dimensions of life he had never properly explored before, settling into the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. I asked him directly whether this meant he regretted marrying me specifically, and he told me no, that it was more complicated than simple regret, a distinction that I accepted at the time as a genuine attempt at honest self-reflection, but that I now understand was actually the careful language of a man already deeply involved in something he was not yet ready to fully confess. I did not know, that evening, sitting on our porch in the gathering dark, that Jacob had met a woman named Naomi during one of his earlier business trips to that same distant district, a woman from a considerably more liberal Amish community than our own, one that permitted certain modern conveniences our own district did not, and that his growing fascination with her, and with the different kind of life she represented, had already begun reshaping his entire understanding of what he actually wanted from his future. I want to tell you about Naomi, because understanding who she was and what she represented to Jacob matters considerably to understanding the full shape of what eventually happened to my marriage. Naomi was 26 years old, 3 years older than I was at the time, recently widowed after her first husband died in a farming accident, roughly 18 months before she met Jacob. She lived in a district that permitted certain technologies our own community considered too closely tied to the outside world, limited electricity in some homes, telephones inside the house rather than only in shared community phone shanties, a slightly different and, by Jacob's eventual account, considerably more appealing version of the life he had always known. Jacob met her, initially through entirely ordinary business circumstances, repairing equipment on the farm she had inherited from her late husband, work that required several visits over the following months as various pieces of aging machinery required ongoing attention. What began as professional interactions slowly became something else entirely, conversations that extended beyond the practical business of equipment repair, an emotional connection that Jacob would later describe to me as having developed gradually, almost without his full awareness, until it had grown large enough that he found himself arranging additional business trips, specifically to create opportunities to see her again. I want to be honest about something that I have come to understand only with considerable time and reflection since these events occurred. Jacob's attraction to Naomi was not, I believe, purely or even primarily about her as an individual person, separate from everything she represented about an alternative version of life that our own marriage and community did not offer. He had, I eventually learned, been carrying quiet doubts about certain aspects of our community's stricter customs for considerably longer than I had ever suspected, doubts that predated his meeting Naomi by years, doubts he had never once shared with me throughout our entire courtship and the early years of our marriage. Naomi, and the more flexible community she belonged to, became for Jacob a tangible representation of an alternative path he had apparently been quietly wondering about for a very long time, a path that our own marriage, built as it was within the more conservative customs of our particular district, had never offered him any realistic opportunity to explore. I found the keys on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while doing laundry, 11 months ago now, nearly 7 months after that first unsettling porch conversation, during a period when Jacob's distance had grown considerably more pronounced, though I had continued, throughout those intervening months, to attribute his behavior to work stress and the ordinary difficulties that every marriage occasionally experiences. I asked him that same evening what the keys were for. He was quiet for a long moment, the same careful, calculating quiet I had observed during our porch conversation 7 months earlier. And then he told me, with what I will acknowledge was considerable visible difficulty, that the keys belonged to a small house he had been renting, under his own name but without my knowledge, in the district where Naomi lived, a house he had begun renting nearly 5 months earlier as a place to stay during his now considerably more frequent business trips to that area. I asked him directly whether he was involved in a relationship with another woman. He did not answer immediately, and his silence, stretching longer than any answer would have required, told me everything before he eventually found words to confirm what I had already understood with complete certainty. He told me, finally, that he had fallen in love with Naomi, that this had developed gradually over the better part of a year, and that he had been trying, throughout the months I now understood to have been filled with this ongoing deception, to determine what he actually wanted to do about a situation he readily admitted he had handled dishonestly and unfairly toward me from the very beginning. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed this confrontation, because they were unquestionably the most painful weeks of my entire life up to that point. A grief and rage so completely entangled that I genuinely struggled, for considerable stretches of those weeks, to distinguish clearly between the two emotions. I confronted Jacob with every question I could think to ask, demanding to understand the full scope of what had been happening throughout the previous year, demanding to know whether our marriage itself had ever been genuinely real to him, given everything I had since learned about doubts he had apparently been carrying since long before our wedding ever took place. His answers, across these difficult conversations, painted a picture considerably more complicated than simple infidelity, though I want to be clear that I do not offer this complexity as any kind of excuse for what he ultimately chose to do. He told me that our marriage had been genuinely real to him during its early years, that his love for me during that period had not been performed or false, but that the quiet doubts he had carried since adolescence about certain aspects of our community's stricter expectations had grown, gradually and then with increasing urgency, until meeting Naomi had given those doubts a concrete shape and a tangible alternative path he found himself unable to resist exploring. I asked him repeatedly why he had not simply told me about these doubts, honestly, years earlier, rather than allowing an entire secret relationship to develop in their place. He told me, with what appeared to be genuine if entirely insufficient remorse, that he had been afraid for years of disappointing me and our families by admitting doubts he did not fully understand himself, and that this fear had eventually led him toward a deception he readily acknowledged was far more damaging than honest uncertainty would ever have been. I want to tell you what happened within our community once the truth of Jacob's relationship with Naomi became known beyond our own household, because the response illustrated, in ways I had not fully anticipated, the particular complexity of how our world handles situations like mine. Jacob's parents were devastated, in ways that extended beyond simple disappointment in their son's choices, given the additional complication that pursuing a full relationship with Naomi would likely require Jacob to eventually leave our more conservative district for her considerably more liberal community, a transition, while not technically requiring him to abandon the Amish faith entirely, represented a significant enough departure from our specific customs that it created real friction with his own family's expectations. Our district's bishop became involved within weeks of the truth becoming known, conducting the kind of careful pastoral counseling our community extends to marriages in crisis. Sessions that I attended alongside Jacob for nearly 2 months. Sessions that I will acknowledge were conducted with genuine care and wisdom on the bishop's part, even though they ultimately failed to produce the reconciliation our community customs generally hope to achieve in situations like ours. Jacob made his final decision roughly 3 months after I first found those keys, informing me, in a conversation considerably calmer than I had expected, given the weight of what he was telling me, that he had decided to pursue his relationship with Naomi fully, which would require him to formally leave our district and eventually relocate to her community, a decision that effectively ended our marriage in every practical sense, even before the formal religious and legal processes required to fully dissolve it had been completed. I want to tell you about the specific moment I finally understood, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, that my marriage had genuinely ended, because I think it matters considerably more than the formal legal processes that eventually followed. Jacob came to collect the last of his belongings from our small house, roughly 4 months after I found the keys, on an ordinary gray afternoon in early spring, and I remember standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we had eaten thousands of meals together across nearly 4 years of marriage, watching him carry out the final boxes containing tools and clothing, and the accumulated small possessions of an entire shared life, and feeling something inside me finally accept, completely, what I had already understood intellectually for months, but had not yet fully absorbed at the deeper level where genuine acceptance actually happens. He paused before leaving for the final time and told me that he was genuinely sorry for the pain he had caused me, that whatever else had happened, his love for our 2 sons remained completely real, and that he intended to remain involved in their lives despite the considerable distance his relocation would create between us. I did not respond with forgiveness in that moment, because I did not feel forgiveness, not yet. watching a man I had built my entire adult identity around, walking out of our shared home for the final time, choosing deliberately and after considerable deliberation another woman and another life over the marriage and family we had built together. I simply watched him go, holding our younger son against my hip, and I felt, more than anything else in that specific moment, an overwhelming exhaustion, as though the previous 4 months of grief and confrontation and slow, painful acceptance had finally arrived at their natural conclusion, leaving behind only the practical work of figuring out how to actually build a life as a single mother within a community that, while supportive in many ways, had no fully established framework for situations exactly like mine. I want to tell you about the months since then, because I think the resolution of this story, such as it is, matters considerably to understanding what I have ultimately taken from this entire painful experience. I have remained within our district, raising our 2 sons with considerable support from my own parents and siblings who have shown up for me throughout this entire difficult year with a consistency and generosity that has become one of the genuine sources of strength I have relied upon to rebuild some semblance of stability. Jacob has maintained, as he promised, regular contact with our sons, traveling back to visit them every few weeks despite the considerable distance, a commitment that I will acknowledge, even now, reflects genuine ongoing love for his children, however complicated my feelings about the rest of his choices remain. He married Naomi roughly 7 months ago in a ceremony I did not attend and was not invited to attend, formalizing the relationship that had already, by that point, completely reshaped the entire trajectory of both our lives. I have spoken with him only as much as coordinating our son's care requires, careful and businesslike conversations that bear almost no resemblance to the easy intimacy we once shared during the better years of our marriage. I think often, even now, about the specific evening on our porch when Jacob first told me he had been wondering whether our life together was actually the life he wanted, a conversation I had genuinely believed, at the time, represented simple temporary uncertainty rather than the early visible signs of a decision he had apparently already been quietly moving toward for considerably longer than I understood. I think about how completely I trusted the foundation of our marriage during those years, how genuinely I believed I had built my adult life upon something solid and lasting, and how thoroughly that belief was eventually proven wrong by a man I had not imagined capable of the sustained deception he ultimately chose to maintain. Here is what I have come to understand, looking back now on the entire arc of this story, from the genuine hope I carried into my wedding day, to the exhausted acceptance I felt watching Jacob carry the final boxes out of our shared home. I do not believe Jacob set out, from the very beginning of our marriage, to deceive me deliberately. I believe instead that he carried genuine doubts about certain aspects of his life and his community for years before he ever met Naomi, doubts he never found the courage to address honestly, and that this unaddressed uncertainty eventually created exactly the kind of vulnerability that allowed a chance meeting with another woman to grow into something large enough to dismantle an entire marriage, family. This understanding does not erase my anger about the specific months of deliberate deception, the rented house and the careful lies about business trips, and the slow, calculated process of building an entire second life while I remained for the better part of a year completely unaware that the marriage I believed in so completely had already begun quietly ending. But it has helped me understand the situation as something more complicated than simple cruelty, which has in its own way made the grief slightly easier to carry forward. I think about the 3 brass keys often, the specific weight of them in my hand on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the way such a small and unremarkable object turned out to be the precise instrument that finally exposed an entire architecture of deception I had no idea existed beneath the surface of my own life. I have learned, through everything this experience cost me, that the foundation of any genuine partnership depends entirely on a level of honesty that cannot be assumed simply because a relationship has survived several good years. It must be actively maintained through every difficult season by both partners choosing, again and again, to bring their genuine doubts and struggles into the light, rather than allowing them to grow unaddressed into something large enough to eventually require an entire second house, an entire second name, an entire second life, built quietly in the shadow of the first one. The day my Amish husband chose another woman was not, I have come to understand, a single dramatic moment of betrayal arriving without warning. It was the visible conclusion of a much longer and quieter process, one that had likely begun years before I ever found those keys. Rooted in doubts Jacob had never found the courage to share honestly, doubts that eventually grew large enough to cost both of us the marriage and family we had spent 4 years building together, one ordinary day at a time, believing the entire time that what we had built was solid enough to last.